So you want to learn how to knit the moss stitch? Well, my friend, you're in just the right place. Alright, so we'll get to the tutorial here in just a moment, but before we do, I want to clear the air a little bit about the name. The moss stitch has, well, a couple different names. Here in America, we call it the moss stitch, but in other parts of the world, it's known as the double moss stitch. Now to those places who call it the double moss stitch, their moss stitch is our seed stitch. I know, it's totally confusing, right? So just make sure that if you're following a pattern or a project, that you're using the correct moss stitch. Figure out that terminology. Now for this demonstration, I'll be using my Clover Takumi interchangeable set. I really love using circular needles for any type of project, not just for working in the round. It makes it very easy and versatile because I always have the right size needle that I need. I don't have to worry about cramming a big project on a small straight needle. My Clover Takumi set has taken over every single needle in my collection. This is the set that I use day after day. I love it so much, and you'll get to see a little bit of that set here in the demonstration. And I just want to say a big thanks to them for sponsoring this episode. All right, now let's start with the cast on. We need to cast on an even number of stitches. Now I like to use the long tail cast on for pretty much anything. So what I'll do is I'll grab me a nice long tail. I'm just going to work with a little swatch here, so I don't need too much. Grab my needle and place that right over. So on this side, it's coming from the skein. This, of course, is the tail. I'll steady that with my finger because I'm not starting with a slip knot. You can do that if you prefer. I like to do it this way. So I'll put my two fingers in between the two loops, and I'm holding on to it down here at the bottom. And then I'll swing my needle around, grab a loop from my thumb, then grab the loop from my finger, and then I'll release my thumb over the tip of the needle. And then give that a pull, make it nice and tight, and repeat. So now we have 2 stitches cast on our needle. Alright, so we've seen that we need to cast on an even number of stitches to work the moss stitch or the double moss stitch. That's going to be the case for both flat knitting and knitting in the round. Now let's have a look at the row repeat. Now that we have our cast on, we're ready to start on the first row. So it's important to note that this particular stitch has a 4-row pattern repeat, but it's very, very simple. All you need to do is know the knit in the purl, and you're well on your way to working this stitch. So the first thing I'll do is get myself set up. What we're going to do here is start off by knitting the first stitch, and then I'll purl the next stitch. And knit the next stitch, and that is our repeat. Knit 1, purl 1. We're going to do that all the way until we get to the end of the row. So if you've done everything correctly, you should end on a purl for your last stitch. And at the end of row 1, we don't really have much to look at, right? It kind of still just looks like a big lump of yarn, but that is okay. So now we're ready to move into row number 2, and it's quite simple. It's just a repeat of row 1. So I can see here that my first stitch is a knit, and then my second stitch is a purl. So I've got that bump there, that purl bump. That's how I know that's a purl. So for this row, we're knitting the knits and we're purling the purls, if that's an easier way for you to think of it, or you can just start with your knit and then purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. We'll do that all the way to the end of the row. Now, just like the first row, we should end on a purl if you've been doing everything correctly. And our work now looks something like this. We can see our 2 rows of knits pretty well. It actually just looks like a 1x1 rib, and that's exactly what it is at this point. And we're ready to move on to row number 3. The other thing you'll notice here is that it looks the same on both sides, so this is a reversible stitch. Now, as we look at our work, we can see that the first stitch we have here is a knit, and the next one is a purl, a knit, a purl, a knit, a purl. We're not surprised by that, but what we need to do for rows 3 and 4 is take everything we've just learned and flip it. So rather than start with a knit, we're going to start with a purl. So I'll purl that first stitch, and then I'll knit the next. So our stitch repeat isn't super different. We're still alternating knits and purls. We're just changing the order a little bit. So in row 3, and in row 3 only, we are purling the knits and knitting the purls. And with row 3 at the end, you will end on a knit. Now this is what your work looks like at the end of our 3rd row. We can go ahead and flip it and set ourselves up to work our 4th and final row of the repeat. And this one is the same as row number 3. We're going to start with a knit, follow up with a purl. The difference here, if you're thinking of it like the terms of knit the knits, purl the purls, or vice versa, this rule doesn't apply as far as saying it's the same as row number 3. What you want to do for this row is purl the purls and knit the knits. Now, I don't like to explain things that way because it's a little bit more confusing. So for me, it's easier just to remember that in row 3 and row 4, we're going to start with a purl 1, and that's going to start our repeat. So purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and so on. And like in row number 3, at the end of row 4, we'll end on a knit. So now this is what our work looks like after we finish our first full pattern repeat. So of course it's 4 rows and it's sort of broken into 2 stitches. So the knits are easier to see, so we'll point those out. We have a knit, and then a knit, and a knit. So when we start on our next row, we'll simply flip it and then work on row number 1 again. Row number 1 and row number 2 is where we start with a knit. And we can see that our first stitch here is a purl. So that means we're doing that transition where we go, it's basically this row right here, where we're transitioning between this pattern and having our 2 knits here versus having them here or here. So that wasn't so bad, right? It's a 4-row repeat, but 2 of those repeats are kind of repeated in themselves. So 1 and 2 are the same, 3 and 4 are the same. We just have to work those 4 rows in a sequence in order to get the pattern that we want. All right, so we've seen how to do flat knitting. That's again when we're flipping it back and forth. Well, what about if we want to knit this in the round? What if we want to make a hat or a bag or something like that? Well, I have good news for you. You don't have to memorize a new row repeat. There's only one subtle difference between flat knitting and knitting in the round for this particular stitch pattern. So I want to start off by showing you a project that I'm working up right now. I'm working on a hat using the moss stitch, or that double moss stitch, and I'm really excited to show it to you and point out that one subtle difference. So I'm in that transition point between the second and the third. So basically where I take this knit and I turn it into 2 purls. Well, the one thing I wanted to point out with this hat is that to demonstrate that you don't necessarily have to start with knits on row 1 and 2 and purls for 3 and 4. I know I'm going to totally confuse you here, but the stitch pattern works the same if you completely flip that order, and that's what I've done with this hat. So instead of starting with a knit on row 1 and row 2 and doing purls for row 3 and row 4, that is completely flipped. So I started with a purl on row 1 and 2, and then now I'm starting with a knit on 3 and 4. So I'm at that transitionary phase. I just finished my last stitch of this round, which was a knit. Now here's the big difference between knitting this in the round and knitting in the flat. When we get to that point where we're transitioning between round 2 and round 3, we're going to do the same stitch twice in a row. So I'll knit that next stitch, and you saw that was a purl, so that's how I know I'm in that transition. And now my next stitch is a knit, so I'll go ahead and pull that forward and purl that next stitch. So you've seen all of this. You get the stitch repeat. This is nothing new here, but in this little segment, what I really wanted to drive home is the difference between knitting in the round and knitting in the flat. And that difference is the transition between round 2 and round 3. You're going to do the same stitch 2 times in a row. And that looks and feels different, right? We're used to doing this knit purl and we're in that rhythm, but this is the one exception to that little rule. So that's not so bad, right? We can see that it's pretty much the same stitch pattern either way. We were also able to see that it doesn't matter if you start row 1 and 2 with a knit or a purl, as long as you do the opposite for rows 3 and 4 or rounds 3 and 4, you get the same outcome. It's pretty cool, right? Okay, so the cast off or the bind off. We do need to make sure that we're doing that in pattern, and I'll demonstrate that here, but also we need to be aware of where we are binding off within our row repeat. Don't worry, it's really simple. Let's see how to do that next. The last thing you'll need to learn with this stitch is how to cast off. So whenever you're finished with your project, doesn't matter if you're flat knitting or if you're knitting in the round, we're going to use the same technique. The main thing we need to realize is that we are going to bind off or cast off in pattern. So we'll follow the same pattern that we normally would. So for me, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. If you're on that third row, then you'll do purl 1, knit 1, and it'll work that way. One other thing I want to point out is why you would need to actually stop on this first or third row. So that way you're binding off on your second or your fourth. Now the reason for that is because we want to make sure that we're following our stitch pattern, or at least the visual part of our stitch pattern. Now we know that it's a 4-row repeat because we've been doing that over and over already, but to the naked eye, it really just looks like it's a 2-row repeat, right? Because we just have 2 here and then it goes into purl. So we have a knit, and then a purl, and a knit, and a knit. We know that it's a 4-row repeat, but what's visible is this pattern or this idea of having 2. So if we were to stop in our second row rather than stop in our first or third, then when we cast off or when we bind off, we'll break that up. We'll have just 1, and then it'll be the end of our work. So that'll throw your pattern off just a tiny bit, ever so slightly, but it's those little details that will really take your knitting to the next level. Okay, let's see how to do this cast off. Now I mentioned that I just finished up row number 1. If you finished up row number 1, you're going to start with a knit. Now if you just finished row number 3, you're going to start with a purl. So whenever we're binding off, casting off, we're going to work the first 2 stitches as normal, or as instructed in our pattern. So I'm knitting the first one, and then I'm going to purl the next one. Now whenever I end on a purl when I'm binding off, I like to just flip that yarn to the back so it gets it out of my way. And then I'll take this first stitch and pass it over the second one. So just kind of pull on it, stretch it out a little bit so that you can slide it up and over that needle. Now my next stitch here is a knit, so I'll go ahead and knit that next stitch. and then bind it off. So pass this one now over the one we just made. Now my next stitch is a purl, so I'll pull the yarn in forward, purl that stitch. I like to just pull that to the back as I pass that stitch over the one we just made. That's the repeat. It's really simple to do these bind offs. Honestly, the hardest part really is just getting it to pass over that stitch without dropping it off of your needle. And that just comes with practice. So I just like to pull it nice and tight, get some slack there in the yarn, and then slide it over. And what you can't really see here is I'm holding on to this stitch with my index finger as I pass it over, so it kind of stays put and it doesn't flip over the tip of the needle. It takes a little bit longer to do it this way, but I'm okay with that. Now when you get to that last stitch, all you'll need to do is pass this stitch right here over that last one that you made, and then we can trim our yarn. And then I just like to pull that through that loop. Now that you know how to knit the moss stitch and the double moss stitch, I would love to see your projects that you're working with this stitch. Go ahead and follow me on Instagram and Facebook and use the hashtag BHooked, BHooked, to share your photos with me. I would love to see the types of projects that you're working with this stitch. I love it. It's a great textured stitch. It's really versatile. You can use it for all sorts of patterns, and I can't wait to see the things that you come up with. I would also encourage you to check out Clover Takumi's interchangeable set, not just because they're sponsoring this video, but because I just love this set. I love the case that it comes with. It's like a black leather or leatherette, and it has a zipper, it has a pouch for your cords so you can keep everything together, and it has like a little elastic holder for every single one of your needles. It has pretty much every needle size that you'll need for any project. It has different cord sizes, so you only need this one set. You can find it at many of your craft stores, and you can also find it on Amazon. If you want to use my affiliate link to get your set, then you'll head over to BHookedCrochet.com/CloverTakumi, and that'll take you straight to the listing on Amazon. And if you purchase through that link, I want to say a big thank you because I do receive a small commission for that sale. Now, one last thing before I go, in the comment section below, tell me the project that you're going to work with the moss stitch. I would love to hear it, love to be inspired by that to perhaps create some patterns with this stitch of my own. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to the B.Hooked YouTube channel. If you loved this video and this style of learning, if you love crochet and you love knitting, well, this is the place for you. I love creating videos to help you learn and expand your craft, whether that be knitting or crochet, through tutorials just like this one, as well as full project tutorials. So subscribe so you'll never miss another episode, and I will be so grateful, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.